to the organizers of this talk and the two centers that are putting it on, and especially Oliver, who contacted me. Oliver, you may not know, was one of my students way back in the day when he was doing his undergrad at the Aberystwyth University in Wales, where I happened to be teaching at the time. So it's lovely to see him, and lovely to see that he's now doing his PhD and living a really interesting life, traveling around. I believe he's in Latin America at the moment. Anyway, the aims of my talk today are just broadly to provide an assessment, a kind of brief assessment and reflection on contemporary counterterrorism, which over the past 2 decades of the war on terrorism has impacted hugely on the course of history and world politics. And in many ways, it's impacted on everyone's daily life. And then secondly, I want to hopefully inspire us to think critically about something that perhaps we have taken for granted, and to consider ending many of the harmful policies of counterterrorism and adopting alternative approaches to the challenges posed by political violence. Now, my own personal motivations for choosing this particular topic are the harms and abuses of counterterrorism, the war on terror, continuing forms of counterterrorism that have been such a huge source of violence and harm for millions of people around the world. I'm also concerned because my own country of New Zealand has been involved in the war on terror, and its involvement in Afghanistan, for example, has resulted in the deaths of innocent civilians. Some of the New Zealand forces have likely been involved in torture, and the security services have been involved in the execution of terror suspects by drone strikes. And as a peace scholar, my life and my work is devoted to violence reduction. I'm also motivated by the Christchurch terrorist attack and its response that occurred a couple of years ago. And obviously this is a very, very big issue over here for us right now, because not that long ago we had a Royal Commission that's put its report out on that attack and recommended a number of responses. And then I'm also motivated by something that continues to amaze and astound me, and that is the failure to properly evaluate counterterrorism. Almost no governments and even just a limited number of scholars have done rigorous evaluation of whether counterterrorism measures actually work. And given the context of growing evidence of the harms and failures of counterterrorism, I find this quite problematic. It's also important to note that I come to this subject as a scholar, not a security practitioner. I come to it as someone with the luxury of political as well as geographic distance, although perhaps less so following the Christchurch attack. I come to it as someone intimately involved with the field of critical terrorism studies, which has been focused on critiquing the war on terror and counterterrorism since its inception. And I come to it as a peace and human rights activist who's always worked to try and promote alternatives to violence and militarism. So just a couple of caveats to my talk. I'm going to speak at a level of generality, focusing on broad level assessment of what I believe to be the dominant paradigm and approaches. I don't intend to essentialize all forms and activities of counterterrorism or imply that all of counterterrorism has failed or is inherently flawed. I do recognize that there have been some counterterrorism successes, and that there are differences in counterterrorism approaches between localities. There are different kinds of counterterrorism policies and approaches applied at different levels, and that there can be differences between counterterrorism policies and what they intend, and then what actors on the ground actually put into practice. Nevertheless, I am convinced that it is possible to argue that first, there is an identifiable dominant approach to counterterrorism, what I always refer to as a dominant counterterrorism discourse, which has been widely adopted across the world and many jurisdictions due to the influence of the United States, the UK, the UN, and so on, that have spread their dominant approach to other places. And then secondly, I think that we can map and assess counterterrorism developments over the past 2 decades and see that they've evolved from, right after 9/11, a largely force-based overseas war on terror kind of approach to perhaps in the past decade, a more domestically oriented counter-radicalization or countering violent extremism kind of approach. I'm going to mostly focus on the dominance of force and the force-based war on terror approach, but I also do have some remarks for the current practices of things like CVE and PVE. So obviously the first obvious question here is, how should we evaluate the success and failure of counterterrorism? And it's important to acknowledge that evaluating the success and failure of any kind of policy is fraught and it's complicated. It's especially challenging in the security area when the absence of certain things, such as terrorist plots, may be an important indicator of success. It's also complicated by the values we bring to the task and by the inevitable gap between policy and its enactment, and by inevitable unforeseen outcomes that come out of policy processes. However, I want to argue that even if we take the most basic and minimal measure of success, and this would be, say, a reduction in the number of terrorist attacks and plots following the enactment of counterterrorism policies, or just an increased level of security from political violence, then it's still difficult to argue that counterterrorism over the past 20 years has been a success. So there's a study by Davis in 2018, which examined whether counterterrorism measures in Western Europe and the United States resulted in fewer terrorist attacks between 2010 and 2015. And he found that despite huge investment and a great many new measures, there were in fact more attacks and more casualties over this period. So the study concluded that the safety of citizens in these regions had actually been reduced over that period. So that's a minimalist approach, but if we take a more maximalist approach and argue that counterterrorism ought to enhance human and community security, promote well-being, promote positive values like democracy, freedom, and equality, enhance things like community cohesion and resilience, then I think it's even clearer that counterterrorism has unquestionably failed across the world. And then lastly, we could approach it from a cost-benefit analysis. If we compare the different costs of counterterrorism, financial costs, opportunity costs, costs to social cohesion, impacts on the rule of law and norms, and so on. And if we compared that to the benefits, the lives saved, the increased levels of security, then again, I also think it's reasonable to argue that counterterrorism has been a failure. So briefly, I just want to set the scene by talking about the failures of counterterrorism. And I could spend a very long time recounting the wrongs and harms of the war on terror over the past few decades, but I just want to mention a few things, and I'm sure none of this is surprising. So if we actually count the cost of the war on terror and counterterrorism in something like human lives, or injuries and so on, and people displaced, the losses have been, immense. According to Physicians for Social Responsibility, the war on terror has resulted in more than 1 million civilian deaths since 2001. And that's a figure that obviously dwarfs the fatalities caused by terrorist attacks in that period. There's been hugely documented abuses of human rights, loss of civil liberties, the securitization of many societies and everyday life. If we think about the financial costs, we're talking about the trillions of dollars. Brown University's Costs of War project counts this. And that this doesn't even include things like the opportunity costs that have come. And many would argue that the lack of preparedness of Western countries, or actually many countries around the world, to the coronavirus pandemic, comes from the fact that so much was spent on counterterrorism and the war on terror. If we look at regional stability and sort of geopolitics, The war on terror and counterterrorism has had devastating effects in places like the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Others have pointed out the impact of counterterrorism on the rule of law, norms like the anti-torture norm and so on that have been eroded through the war on terror. If we just take it from a sort of military strategy perspective, you know, failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, if we think about the increased number of terrorist groups since 2001, the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy nature of the war on terror, the missed opportunities to respond to white supremacist threats, which was a finding that came out of the Royal Commission into the Christchurch attack. You know, the way counterterrorism was focused on Muslims, and they kind of missed what was happening in other spheres. And then if we think about this, you know, take a sort of ethical perspective and just think about the ethical failures of counterterrorism, the massive use of torture, and the undermining of the torture, anti-torture norm, rendition, drone killings, Islamophobia, increased racism, the erosion of social norms, the acceptance of violence, you know, undermining community cohesion and so on. I think it's possible to say that there's been an awful lot that's failed in counterterrorism. So just to get to the meat of what I want to talk about, why has counterterrorism failed? And there isn't, I think, any single reason, but I just want to go through and mention a few things. So at the most basic level, and something that I've already hinted at, the first thing I would mention is that counterterrorism sort of approaches, measures, and spending has not been properly evaluated for its effectiveness and its costs and benefits. And this is a big thing. I mean, it's a really basic thing that when you have an area of public policy, particularly one that involves spending vast amounts of money and has such huge potential consequences for society, there ought to be procedures in place to constantly evaluate its effectiveness and the costs and benefits. And this is something that we just have not really seen in the area of counterterrorism. And we haven't seen it both in the academic field or the government policy arena. So Andrew Silk, for example, has done several studies on the terrorism studies field's core journals, and in other studies by Sherman, it's demonstrated that the focus of the field remains largely on analyzing threats and focusing on jihadist-based groups, events in the MENA region, and very little space very little effort has gone into evaluating counterterrorism effectiveness. In another study, Silk and Schmidt Peterson found that only 3 out of the 100 most cited articles on terrorism focused in any way on evaluating the effectiveness of counterterrorism. I did a sort of content analysis of 2 of the main terrorism journals, just over 2 volumes in 2017 to 2018, and found that only 42 out of 247 articles, or 17% of them, in any way focused on counterterrorism and its evaluation. And most of these were descriptive, based on single case studies, or conceptually oriented. Almost none of them advanced specific criteria for the evaluation of counterterrorism measures, or attempted to provide systematic empirical evidence about whether the counterterrorism measures were successful or not. Now, this evidence backs up the findings of the only major study to date on the overall state of empirical research on counterterrorism by Lum, Kennedy, and Shirley. And I think that they're about to release another version of this, but they released a version in 2006 and 2009. And they did a Campbell review analysis, which demonstrated that the empirical evaluation of the effectiveness of different counterterrorism approaches, strategies, and measures is poor, both by governments, agencies, and academics. Specifically, in their initial study, they found that out of 20,000 studies on terrorism, 354 or 1.5% sought to evaluate counterterrorism measures in some way. And out of these, only 7 of them, and I quote, contained moderately rigorous evaluations of counterterrorism programs. We conclude that there is little scientific knowledge about the effectiveness of most counterterrorism interventions. Further, from the evidence we were able to locate, it appears that some evaluated interventions either didn't work or sometimes increased the likelihood of terrorism and terrorism-related harms, end quote. Perhaps more worryingly, Luhmann and her colleagues did not find any evidence that the minuscule proportion of government counterterrorism spending related to research had been directed towards evaluating these counterterrorism programs. And they went on to argue that, and I quote, with the decision to commit funds to anti-terrorism strategies comes the responsibility to know whether these programs are effective. Now, this is an argument that's also been emphasized by Mueller and Stewart, who've done, quite rigorous evaluation of homeland security measures in the United States since 9/11. According to kind of established policy evaluation frameworks. And again, they found them to be extremely costly and largely ineffective. So I think, this is just one simple practical reason why counterterrorism fails, because there's very little research or evaluation that's done to see whether things are effective. A second main reason that I want to discuss is, and it's a bit more controversial, is I think there's growing empirical evidence that the choice to use counter-violence and force as a primary mode of responding to terrorism is flawed. So I base this on a growing body of evidence that shows that violence is a very ineffective kind of tool. So Dustin Howes, for example, lists a few of these, and he lists some studies, for example, which show that there's growing evidence that powerful states who have great military superiority are winning wars less and less, or finding it harder to win wars. And there's no guarantee that military superiority and the use of, really extreme violence helps you win wars. There's certainly very little evidence that the violent suppression of popular protest brings regime security. In fact, there's evidence that that can backfire. So the use of force doesn't work there. There's a growing body of research which shows that terrorism as a strategy of violent contention doesn't really work either. And I would argue that, what I want to show is that notwithstanding the lack of evaluation that I've mentioned just a minute ago, there is a small but starting to grow, and I think it's a significant body of evidence showing that the use of violent forms of counterterrorism also mostly fails. For example, there's empirical evidence which examines how terrorist campaigns end. And this shows that using violent forms of suppression rarely works. So the Jones and Libicki study from 2008 from the Rand Corporation, for example, shows that out of hundreds of terrorist campaigns that ended, only something like 7% of them ended because of military force. The majority of them ended through political dialogue or intelligence kind of related measures. Similarly, there's a growing number of studies that have examined whether the use of violent repression by states reduces terrorism. The overall findings from this research are quite clear. So ARAG, for example, in 2008 finds that rather than reducing terrorism, and I quote, harsh state repression is a major cause of suicide bombing. Dugan and Chenoweth from 2012 conclude that, and I quote, repressive actions have never led to decreases in terrorism and have sometimes led to increases in terrorism. They did an empirical study on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And James Piazza in 2017 finds that, and I quote, while forms of repression that close off nonviolent avenues of dissent and boost group grievances increase the amount of domestic terrorism a country faces, types of repression that raise the costs of terrorist activity have no discernible effect on terrorism. Similarly, Asal et al. In 2018 conclude that, and I quote, government coercion against a group is associated with subsequent terrorism by that group. Other empirical research has confirmed that states experience more terrorism after they engage in military interventions. There's a famous study from the Cato Institute in 1998 that demonstrates a clear correlation between US military intervention abroad and increases in anti-American terrorism. I think if we look more closely at specific counterterrorism tools, there have been numerous studies on things like the effectiveness of so-called leadership decapitation strategies, drone strikes. These studies have different metrics, data, and methods and produce somewhat contrasting and somewhat inconclusive findings. Some scholars, like Dan Byman, for example, concludes that drone strikes can be a useful counterterrorism tool. But I think there's a larger number of studies that have found that they're either ineffective or counterproductive. And Abrams and Muro, for example, conclude that leadership decapitation leads to greater indiscriminate violence by militant groups, often because the more moderate leaders get killed, and so more radical leaders take their place. Lastly, given the centrality of the use of torture as a counterterrorism tool during the early phases of the War on Terror, as well as its use in other counterterrorism campaigns in places like Spain, Algeria, Israel, and elsewhere, it's also important to look at that research, and there the evidence is absolutely clear. So studies based on game theory, to case study analysis, surveys of professional interrogators, the neuroscience of interrogation, and a great many others, it can confidently be asserted that torture has proven to be a highly ineffective counterterrorism tool. And in fact, it's likely to be a recruitment driver for terrorist groups. So, I mean, what we're saying here is that there's a small but significant literature that shows that the use of violent force as a counterterrorism tool, and violent force has been sort of part of the dominant paradigm for a long time, really, there's no evidence that it works, and there's some evidence that it is counterproductive. So the question is, why does violence fail as a policy tool? I mean, I don't want to go into this in too much detail. I've written about it elsewhere, but I think there are a few basic points that we can draw from social theory and our understanding of the theories about power. And the use of violence in counterterrorism at a fundamental level misunderstands the relationship between violence, force, coercion, and power. So in particular, it misunderstands the relationship between brute force and coercion, failing to note how the effectiveness of violence to deter or compel depends entirely on how people respond to the violence, not the violence itself. So the capacity to destroy bears no direct relationship to the ability to coerce. And violent actions or threats, such as overwhelming force and counterterrorism, can produce either submission and deterrence or resistance and retaliation. And this is something we've definitely seen in the War on Terror, where the use of shock and awe in Iraq, for example, did not produce submission and deterrence, but it actually ignited, in some ways, a massive campaign of resistance. I think, what's happening here is that the reliability of violence as a political tool is being overestimated. And in part, this is also because using violence doesn't have predictable political results. There's no, at another level, social theorists know that there's no simple or linear relationship between violence and power. So Hannah Arendt, for example, argued that power and violence are opposites, where the one rules absolutely, the other is absence. Violence can destroy power. It is utterly incapable of creating it. And similarly, Stellan Windhagen explains how power and violence are analytically distinct, giving that violence is a form of unilateral action, whereas power is by definition relational. And so he suggests as a consequence that the most extreme result of violence, the killing of a human being, is something that ensures that there will never again be subordination within that relationship. Killing results in an absolute absence of power. In fact, violence is a failure of power, is what he says. And I think we also have to keep in mind that, you know, and in keeping with basic social theory, we have to recognize that violence can never be purely instrumental, but rather it is constitutive. It's constitutive of identities, ethics, practices, and politics. I mean, at the very least, the war on terror and counterterrorism constitutes society through the institutionalization and normalization of the counterterrorism system and the normalization of violence as a political or security instrument. It constructs at both the national and global levels a securitized and militarized context in which further political violence is possible and indeed highly likely. It reifies the social practice of political violence and constitutes and perpetuates violent forms of politics. Now, just as an important aside here, it's important to note that I think that there's no a priori theoretical reason for thinking that violent actors, including terrorists, cannot be deterred or convinced to change their behavior using other non-violent means. It's perfectly possible to resist, exert power against, or coerce other actors without the threat or employment of physical violence. As we've seen historically in terms of groups such as the IRA or ETA, things like shame, appeals to common values, reputational damage, threats to economic resources, political influence, and so on, can exert power to change behavior, as can the promise of material or political rewards. As Barbara Deming explains it a few decades ago, and I quote, "To resort to power, one need not be violent." And it's perfectly possible to use physical force to obstruct, frustrate the will of those who would kill, but in ways that do not violate that person in fundamental ways. In short, there's no theoretical or logical reason to think that violence is necessarily the only effective or necessary response to acts of terrorist violence. So I guess what I'm saying here is that there is a fundamental issue around the nature of violence and its use as a tool in response to security threats that hasn't been fully thought through. And I think that this is one of the key reasons, the overwhelming and at times reliance on violence as a counterterrorism tool. This is one of the reasons why counterterrorism fails. In many ways, the war on terror has produced and constructed more violent resistance than it's actually resolved or prevented. And that's because of the nature of violence. So another key issue that I want to raise, which I think helps explain the failure of counterterrorism, is what I have spent my kind of academic life examining, and that is the discourse of terrorism, the language of terrorism, which provides the kind of conceptual and epistemological framework for how we think about counterterrorism. And what we have since 9/11 is a language about terrorism and terrorists that is deeply demonizing, dehumanizing, and depoliticizing. You know, Lisa Stampnitzky's amazing study on the origins of the terrorism field reveals how, you know, it used to be, there used to be a language around terrorism that was kind of morally neutral and saw it as a strategy of political contention, but that from the 70s onwards, it became imbued with a deep moral opprobrium. So it became associated with a kind of evil and a kind of nihilism that just function to demonize and dehumanize terrorists in a way that didn't apply if you thought about insurgents or militants. Now, the failure here is that there's a failure to recognize how the language employed limits policy options, enables and constrains certain kinds of practices, and creates self-fulfilling prophecies. So, for example, I've written about how the demonizing and dehumanizing language of counterterrorism enabled things like torture, rendition, and the prisoner abuse that we saw in places like Abu Ghraib in 2004. But at the same time, this demonizing language constrains policy options because it's difficult to engage in political dialogue with groups that are described as evil, fanatical, and so on. Very hard to have that kind of dialogue. So the language constrains the options that policymakers have. I think at the heart of this language and this discourse as well are some conceptual flaws. And I've written about this in relation to what I've called the epistemological crisis of counterterrorism, which is an epistemic posture that's rooted in, again, what Lisa Stampnitzky called the politics of anti-knowledge. And by this, she means the rejection of previous knowledge of terrorist actors in history. So what we saw after 9/11 was very powerful arguments from all kinds of powerful actors, which said, this is a new kind of terrorism. It's something we've never seen before. We can't learn anything from history. You know, the long history of dealing with insurgencies and political violence around the world in different contexts can tell us nothing about this new kind of evil, fundamentalist, fanatical violence. And so there was a rejection of any kind of knowledge that might have been useful for helping us think about responding to terrorism. Now that was combined with a fundamentalist precautionary approach to risk. You know, the 1% doctrine. If there's even 1% chance that terrorists could, you know, unleash a violent attack, then we have to act. So you put that together, a rejection of knowledge of terrorists with an extreme precautionism, and then you have to come up with imaginative ideas about what terrorists might do. And then you respond, you build your counterterrorism response about an imaginative idea of what these evil terrorists might be plotting. And what we've seen here is that kind of epistemic posture and that kind of, a mental structure has, you know, contributed to the enabling conditions for things like the use of torture. And included in this particular epistemic posture is what I've called the unknown knowns, and that is the things that we know which we've decided not to know. And this relates to things like an acknowledgement that, you know, political dialogue and negotiations can often be an effective way of reducing terrorism. Now we know this from many historical campaigns, but that knowledge gets kind of suppressed within this particular paradigm. So I think, you know, the language, the paradigm, the kind of knowledge that we've prioritized and the way in which we've dehistoricized and decontextualized and dehumanized terrorists and denied their humanity, again, is another reason that flows into why counterterrorism fails. And this leads directly on to, I think, the diagnostic failure, which I want to emphasize. There's been a huge failure, I think, of diagnosis. So instead of, you know, effectively trying to understand what leads to groups and individuals taking up arms as a tool of political contention, the counter-terrorists have failed to really understand why that is, and part of that relates to this epistemological crisis of counterterrorism, and a lot of it relates to the dehistoricization of terrorism origins, and what I briefly mentioned, the new terrorism thesis, which refuses to acknowledge the historical nature of terrorism. I think there's also been a kind of atomistic view which fails to acknowledge the dynamic interaction between states and terrorists, between individuals and groups, and the kind of action-reaction cycle. So, you know, when you take history out of it, you fail to see how evolutions happen where groups react to states, and then states react to the groups, and then groups react again to the states, in a cycle that leads, in many cases, to violence. So there's been in other words, there's been a huge failure to learn from history about the origins of terrorism, as people like Richard English have powerfully argued. And I think related to this, particularly in terms of the kind of new paradigm of counterterrorism, which focuses on preventing violent extremism and counter-radicalization that we've seen in the last few years, there's a reductionist and misplaced focus on ideology and on the individual agency of actors as the primary source or cause of terrorism. And I can't go into it, I haven't got time, but also scholars like Tahir Abbas and Aaron Kundnani and a great many others have pointed out the many weaknesses and failures of contemporary CVE and PVE approaches, including things like the psychological and sociological diversity of militant individuals, as well as their general normality, the lack of a sort of psychological profile, the very non-linear process of individual involvement in violent groups and movements, and the often non-ideological reasons why individuals get involved. The failure to distinguish between cognitive and behavioral factors in so-called radicalization processes. There are big question marks analytically and scientifically about the causal power of beliefs, which are changeable, intersubjective, and often situated and contextual rather than, you know, just like marbles in people's brains. In fact, there's no hard evidence to suggest that ideology impacts on an individual's propensity to use violence in some kind of causally independent manner. The greater importance of relationships between individuals and groups and the effect of what we call radicalized settings in generating so-called radicalized individuals. The conceptual problems of distinguishing what we mean by radical versus moderate opinion, as well as between violent radicalism versus non-violent radicalism, like radical pacifism. You know, the concepts of extreme and radical are highly contingent and shift over time, and the line between moderate and extreme is unclear. I mean, there's a lack of scientific data, peer review, and validation for models of radicalization that then become the basis for CVE programs. And quoting Githens, Mazur, and Lambert in 2010, radicalization is a research topic plagued by assumption and intuition, unhappily dominated by conventional wisdom rather than systematic, scientific, and empirically based research. I think we also have to think about the racist focus on Islams and Muslims in this kind of program, and the quite often failure to apply the same assumptions and models to other kinds of terrorists, such as paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, white nationalists and white supremacists, anti-abortionists, and so on. The point is that the dominant psychological models which are used to create CVE policies and programs today in many countries are based on flawed conceptual models backed up by little or no empirical validation. In fact, some people have gone so far as to call it junk science. And then I think finally, in this, you know, in this failure to diagnose the sources of political violence, the depoliticization is very clear. And, you know, the focus on religion and ignoring and downplaying the role of foreign policy, military intervention, and political grievance. As I mentioned right at the beginning, there's empirical evidence to show very strong connections between things like foreign military intervention and military occupations overseas and increases in terrorism. There's also studies that show a correlation between military assistance programs and terrorism. So, in conclusion, what can we take from this brief overview of contemporary counterterrorism and the reasons for its failure? I think for scholars, there are a number of conclusions to be taken. There's obviously a necessity for a great deal more research on terrorism effectiveness. There's a need for greater context, history, and politics in the analysis of terrorism. I think there has to be greater sensitivity to the constituting and influential role of language, epistemology, and discourse. We need a stronger critical awareness and assessment of the limits of violence, and a greater willingness to take non-violence and pacifism more seriously, and a closer attention to ethical issues around the harms of counterterrorism, including serious consideration, as I've argued in some contexts, of withdrawing cooperation with official counterterrorism programs if they result in direct harm to individuals and communities. For policymakers and practitioners, I think my analysis suggests the need for a full and frank recognition and counting of the harms, failures, and limitations of counterterrorism that goes beyond the kind of governmental inquiries that we saw after the Iraq War, for example, including a recognition of the harms caused to the Muslim community. Interestingly, in New Zealand, the Royal Commission that we had on Christchurch has started to acknowledge the harms caused to the Muslim community by the Islamophobic nature of the counterterrorism campaign up to that point. I think policymakers need to have a proper evaluation of counterterrorism approaches, measures, and actors using rigorous and measurable criteria. And there needs to be a willingness to take a contextual, historical, and dynamic approach to terrorism analysis, which properly acknowledges the role of foreign policy, political grievance, and broader cultures of militarism and violence, along with a willingness to take proper note of the scientific research that's come out on these things. And I think there also needs to be a transformation of language and discourse away from dehumanizing and demonizing terrorists and terrorism. This is also the responsibility of the media and politicians. And I think there also needs to be the adoption of a broader and deeper concept of security, which goes much further than the number of terrorists killed or captured or the number of plots thwarted. So I think both academics and policymakers need to acknowledge the failure of counterterrorism and start a serious search for alternatives to the approaches that have been adopted so far. And I don't have time to go into it, but perhaps in Q&A, there are many possibilities and there are growing areas of research which can tell us a little about that. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Jackson, for that talk. Very engaging and clear outline of critiques, perhaps against mainstream, more state-centered approaches. We're going to now move on to a Q&A. We've got about 40 minutes for a Q&A to ask Professor Jackson some questions about what he's been speaking about today. We've got two formats really to do this Q&A. I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves and ask questions directly. You can do that by putting your hand up, or you can ask a question via chat, and the director of this center, my colleague, Professor Andreas Bieler, will read the questions out by the chat as we take them. So I'll start off by unmuting, allow people to unmute themselves, and if Yasmin, you'd like to go first, that would be appreciated.
Thank you very much. I think I'm thinking about maybe the ethical side, an ethical argument that could be put to you about like saving, if there was evidence even of like a policy saving maybe or preventing one plot or one terrorist activity, that's like, I suppose, one life, and their family would be so grateful that they've been saved. And I think I'm thinking of like the domestic public's propensity to sort of not see a terrorism act on the TV and not think this is evil. You know, it's that balance between what the public sees, and then if the government did announce, oh, we're actually going to decrease security, and then someone was killed and their family found out there's recently been cuts. I think it's really difficult. I'd love to hear your response to that sort of idea.
Okay, great. Yeah, good question. I think, you know, ethical reasoning in the security area is really complex. And I think, you know, sometimes there is a tendency for us to come up with sort of simple scenarios like that, and define the limits of what's going to influence our ethical reasoning, and then try to make a decision based on that. So in this situation, I would suggest that one of the things that we need to do when we think about the ethics of this is not just consider, well, there's several things to consider. So one of the things to consider is government spending, right? And the value that's placed on different types of lives. So this is something that John Mueller and Stewart talked about in their book as well. What you can do is you can actually, if you look at health spending, road safety spending, spending on domestic violence programs and so on, you can kind of work out how much money gets spent for how many lives get saved. And then you can work out the cost of saving one life in each of those areas. So I think when it comes to ethical reasoning, what we need to think about is it more ethical to spend $1 million? And Mueller and Stewart worked out that it was over $1 million spent to save one life from a terrorist attack. When if you spent $1 million on domestic violence prevention, you could save the lives of 20 women per year. Whereas, and if you spent it in road safety, you could save the lives of 15,000. And if you spent it in health prevention, you could save the lives of so many others. So I think one of the key questions here is huge amounts of money, trillions of dollars has been spent on counterterrorism. And it's inevitably saved some lives, but at what cost in other areas? I mean, if that money had been spent, for example, say a big proportion of the counterterrorism money had been spent on preparedness for a pandemic, could the UK have saved 100,000 lives? And would that have been better? You know, these are the kinds of ethical questions. And I think other ethical questions revolve around, whether or not putting the resources into saving lives around a terrorist attack actually works better than preventing the reasons for people becoming terrorists. Like, it's always the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. So if the measures that you're taking will save a life but do nothing to prevent the next attack, so that, you know, other people might be at risk going forward into the future, then your counterterrorism measure perhaps is not as ethical as you think it is. So I guess what I'm saying is there are lots of different ways in which we need to try and bring in the ethics. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is the way in which violent forms of counterterrorism have, I mean, at the most basic level, they've not actually saved lives because they haven't reduced the amount of terrorist attacks. In fact, you know, since the war on terror, the number of terrorist attacks has gone up. So they're applying this violence. And then the other side of it is simply that far more people have died in counterterrorism than have died from terrorism since the war on terror. I mean, way more people are killed by counterterrorism measures, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa and other places around the world, than are killed by terrorist attacks. So I think these are the kinds of ethical considerations that we need to expand our discussions on.
Thanks for that, Richard. Over to you, Gabriel, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you very much. So this question is in relation to an article that yourself, Professor, wrote for Perspectives on Terrorism in 2008, where you argue that recognizing state terrorism would be an effective tool in scrutinizing counterterrorism. Mm-hmm. And you note that, in fact, counterterrorism could pass that threshold of terrorism itself. Could you kind of elaborate on what the ramifications of considering counterterrorism organizations as terrorism themselves? Could you potentially elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, I think, you've put it very well there, and I think no one can be in any doubt that the ramifications would be quite profound. I mean, and in a way, this goes back to the previous question about ethics, because one of the things that I didn't say in my talk, but which I've said in that article and which you've raised, is that part of scrutinizing counterterrorism has to be a robust and honest assessment of whether the counterterrorism that we're doing actually itself meets the definition of what terrorism is. Itself has become a terrorizing kind of approach for certain individuals and communities and countries and regions around the world. And I think if there was that honest recognition, then I think a lot of counterterrorism would quite quickly stop, and there would be a serious attempt to rethink our approaches. Yeah, the likelihood of this happening, I think, is fairly low, but it is our job as critical scholars, I think, to try and make this case, to try and convince policymakers to seriously look at what they're doing, to make sure that the kind of counterterrorism measures that they're enacting all over the place don't meet the definition of terrorism itself. At one level, this is unsurprising, because what we know about violence is that it's mimetic. Violence produces violent reactions, and there's that famous philosophical argument that when you fight with monsters, be aware that you don't become a monster yourself. And this relates back to the constitutive nature of political violence. I mean, if we use political violence, then we constitute ourselves as violent actors in the same way that terrorists constitute themselves as violent actors. So there is this inherent danger of relying on violence to counter violence, that the violences become indistinguishable. And I think what this forces us to do, particularly as IR scholars, I think, is to seriously look at our ontology of violence and our epistemology of violence, and recognize that it's not just an instrument. It can never be just an instrument. It's not a tool. It actually becomes part of you, and it becomes part of your identity, your ethics, and so on. I mean, yeah, the war on terror is just such a perfect example of how, right after 9/11 in the White House, when Rumsfeld and others said, we've got to take the gloves off. We've got to get down in the gutter with the terrorists, and we've got to be even, in a way, what they were saying is we've got to be bigger terrorists than them in order to defeat them. And that's where, torture and abuse of prisoners kind of had its origins. And the use of photographs and so on of the torture abuse was a form of terrorism, because it sent a message out to the other terrorists and to the other militants. Yeah, I think this is probably too much of a recognition. I think one of the reasons why we can continue to engage in a war on terror around the world is because we deeply believe we're doing the right thing, and because we believe we're saving lives and that we are not the terrorists. And it might be too much to think that there could be an honest reckoning of that.
Thank you for that, Professor Jackson. Adele, over to you.
Thanks. Talking about, it's a lovely talk actually, and I finalize, from my own perspective, after listening to the talk, it seems that, and from the background it came from, violence never been the solution. Violence creates violence, as Mr. Jackson just mentioned, and the violence actually generates more terror. Violence seems to be a tool to achieve some political agenda. But violence never been the solution. For example, in Syria, they said that they defeated ISIS, but has it been defeated by violence? No, we saw a few scenarios with the Houthis recently. They haven't been defeated by the Saudis and the Emiratis and the allies, the talks itself, and we saw the IRA as well before with the British. The question, Mr. Jackson, here, after being reading a couple of articles, it's about violence. Mr. Jackson, do you think the state terrorism can be ever legitimate? And sorry if I have another question as well. And do you think there's a relationship or there's a difference between state terrorism and terrorism or violence? And the last question, what do you think, Mr. Jackson, about the fact that there are so many definitions of state terror, state violence, and terrorism? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer all of those questions effectively, but I mean, if we're talking about legitimacy in terms of you know, doctrines of international politics, I think that there are tricky questions there about the way in which state violence can be legitimate. But you know, my own view is that violence can't be justified. Which is a slightly different position, but I don't think it can be justified because there are alternatives to violence, and because violence has such powerful constitutive consequences and unpredictable results and so on, and causes harm, and it's irreversible and so on and so forth. So yeah, I would say, I mean, that some international jurists might be able to legitimize forms of state violence, and we might say that those forms of state violence perhaps meet some definition of terrorism, but the jurists would say they're legitimate nonetheless, according to state doctrine. But I think it's certainly debatable. But I would say state terrorism is never, you know, can never be justified, and I don't think it can be moral or ethical. And I don't, yeah, support it. And to be honest, I can't remember all the other questions exactly now.
Oh, sorry, I can just, what is, do you think there's a relationship or any difference between state violence, state terrorism, or in a way, or terrorism themselves? And
okay, yeah.
And the last question is, sorry, the last question, what do you think about that in fact, that there are so many definitions of terror, state violence, and terrorism?
Yeah. So, yeah, this is something that I was trying to allude to in my talk a little bit, but I didn't get to it. You know, there's a kind of myth out there that terrorism comes out of nothing, that you know, Western societies in particular, or any society, they're not doing anything wrong, they're just going along, they're normal, and then suddenly for no reason terrorists pop out and start attacking them. To be honest, I think, you know, we have to take a much more historical approach. We also have to take an approach which involves listening to and talking to those political actors that use terrorism to try and find out why they're doing it and what their motivations are and how they got to that point where they felt they needed to use violence for their political contention. And when we do that, I think we find that there is, in many cases, a strong relationship between acts of state violence and forms of state repression, or forms of state policies that cause deep harm and grievance to particular communities, and then the reaction of terrorism that comes along. And then sometimes the state reacts to initial forms of protest with state terrorism that then provokes more terrorism. And I think in many ways there is this kind of, yeah, dynamic, cyclical and escalatory relationship that occurs between states and non-state actors that propels terrorism on both sides. Not to mention, of course, that we've seen huge campaigns of state terrorism over the years, which have killed millions of people. And we shouldn't really minimize it. But this leads to your final question, which is around definitions. And what's interesting here is that, you know, states themselves have always failed to come up with a definition of terrorism and put it into international law, partly because they're wary of the fact that they might fall foul of such a definition. And so the term has been much more fluid and flexible than this. You know, a lot of us call it an empty signifier. You know, it's a term that gets filled and used by different actors for their own purposes. And I think this is part of the sort of function of the definition of terrorism, is that states can adopt that definition that suits their purposes. And one thing we've seen over the last 20 years is the increased use of definitions and laws against terrorism to control things like political opposition, protest, and resistance from different groups. And in many ways, this, you know, undermines the definition of terrorism, undermines the possibility of having a clear and accepted definition that we can all apply. And it undermines the possibility of a definition of terrorism that would also apply to states as well as non-state actors.
Thank you for that. I'm going to move on to Andreas now, who's been patiently looking through the chat box for a selection of questions, and Andreas will be reading out the questions to Richard to answer, so that everyone can understand the question that's being answered. So over to you, Andreas.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Richard, for the excellent talk. There are quite a few questions coming in your way there, and perhaps if you don't mind, I take 3 together in one go as they came in. Would that be okay?
Sure.
And then
Yep, I'll write them down.
And then good, and then we see how far we get. So the first question which came in was by Frank Milligan, and he said that you mentioned intelligence-related measures, I think, as an alternative to counterterrorism. If you could please expand on that. That's the first question. The second question is by Afnan, and she asked, what is your view of Shamima Begum, the case of the so-called ISIS bride? And then the third question is, what role do you think that artificial intelligence will play in the future of counterterrorism programs? And I think that's quite a lot. So over to you, Richard.
Yeah, look, great questions, and I'm not sure that I have the expertise to answer all of them, or to answer them properly. When I mentioned intelligence, I think I was shortening that from intelligence and policing, and I was thinking about the role that, information and relationships and knowledge plays, so that, for example, there are really interesting cases, and there are really interesting communities where there's a level of trust between the authorities and the community, and so when people start to plan or plot violence, there are networks of people who can supply that information to the authority, and kind of preventive measures can be taken. The people can be talked to, or they can be diverted away from pursuing violence. Now, I think this, you know, is a serious kind of alternative model that we can apply that might, in the end, obviate the need for using coercion and some of the measures that we've seen in the war on terror. The thing is that it relies a lot on trust, and the problem is that if you use things like torture and coercive interrogation, then that provides an ethical and moral reason why individuals would not tell the authorities information about a potential terrorist suspect, because they don't want their friends or family members or people they know or members of their community being abused and tortured by the police. So for that kind of counterterrorism to work, there has to be a very strong commitment to upholding human rights and upholding people's dignity and acknowledging their humanity and treating them as human beings. And the whole kind of dehumanizing and demonizing and then violently coercing people approach that we've seen so much in the war on terror has to be put aside for an alternative kind of approach. So that's what I'm kind of thinking of. I mean, related to the third question about AI, I'm definitely not an advocate for things like mass surveillance and the use of information technology to try and detect potential terrorist activity and so on, because first of all, there's no evidence that that's really been effective or worked, and it's certainly not cost effective. You know, there's absolutely, yeah, pretty much zero evidence that any terrorists have been convicted on the basis of those forms of mass surveillance. But also, we have serious, I mean, this is not my area, and other people will know better than me, but there are serious questions around the implicit biases and racism, for example, within algorithms, and the way in which machine learning can take on the biases of the programmers and so on. And I think we have to be really super careful, you know, about using AI in counterterrorism. I'm much more convinced that a historicized, humanized, and political approach to counterterrorism is really where we need to go. And, you know, a rejection of the demonizing language of terrorism and a focus on people and individuals and why they feel the need to contest their politics violently, and why they don't feel that they can engage in politics in non-violent ways, and why their grievances are so powerfully motivating of their violence. And I think, you know, a counterterrorism that sort of comes from that perspective has much more potential, I think, to be effective and to be ethical and to be cost effective, and to have a lot less costs and harms than approaches either based in violence and force, or on things like AI and mass surveillance and the use of technology as a kind of preventive measure. In terms of you know, former ISIS brides and particularly Shamina, I don't know this case that well. There's probably not a lot I can say, but you can probably tell from my broader perspective. I think the most important thing is to treat people as human beings, to recognize the ability of human beings to make mistakes, to learn from those mistakes, and not to demonize them in ways that essentialize them as kind of purely evil. I mean, I didn't get a chance to mention it, but we know, for example, the kind of de-radicalization program, some of the de-radicalization programs in Denmark, for example, that have taken a much more humanistic approach, have been very effective. And I think that, you know, people, regardless of their involvement in terrorism, need to have their human rights respected, because otherwise, once you start, you know, categorizing certain people as not having human rights, that's a slippery slope to undermining human rights norms. So I think, you know, this case should be guided by upholding of human rights and treating people as human beings, you know, and yeah, recognizing humanity rather than a securitized, demonizing kind of approach. I don't know if that's useful in any way, but that's all I can say.
Do we have some more questions over there, Andreas?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Richard. Here are another three, if that's okay with you. So the next one is from Stephen Ball, who asks about how you associate the relation between terrorism and democratic deficit at the national level. That's the first one. Just need to scroll down. Then we have one by Joanna Golikova. She asks, how can we achieve a true regime change and establish the kind of democratic society the US and its allies have promised to achieve? How do we establish such a legitimate regime with strong enough military to handle insurgencies themselves, hence not needing outside help? Question. And then I have a further question by Drew East. My question is scholarship fundamentally limited in its ability to understand the phenomenon of terrorism and come up with potential counterterrorism solutions by its lack of access to classified intelligence? I saw a talk about the tension between academics who study publicly accessible information and intelligence analysts who study confidential information that cannot be shared with the public. How can we bridge this gap and make scholarship valuable and respected given this obstacle? Thank you again. Over to you, Richard.
All right. Again, fantastic questions. This is obviously a really intelligent and insightful audience, and I'm grateful to be speaking to you. Yeah, the first question about whether there's an association between terrorism and democratic deficits, I think, is an interesting one. I don't think there's a clear answer. I mean, I think, you know, in my understanding of terrorism as I've gained it over the last 20 years or so, is that you have to look at each case or each country or each campaign and do a deep dive historically and politically and socially and economically and so on to really gain an understanding. There's always contingencies, so we can't really, I don't think, make generalizations. You can't make a generalization which says if there's a democratic deficit, then, you know, there will be acts of terrorism because people don't have democratic ways of pursuing their goals and having their grievances. In many ways, it will depend upon the civil society actors and the political groups. It is just as possible that in situations of democratic deficit, non-violent movements will arise. You know, groups will be committed to mass civil resistance and civil disobedience, and there might be a non-violent campaign to try and overcome that democratic deficit. But, you know, it may be that if the state responds to that non-violent movement with mass repression and huge amounts of violence, that then parts of that non-violent movement may decide non-violence is not working, so then we need to move to, you know, violent forms of contention, including acts of terrorism. So, you know, the answer to that is a very historically and spatially contingent one. It depends. But I think there is no doubt that if you block people's aspirations, if you block their ability to pursue their political grievances and their political demands through democracy and non-violent political means, then you certainly raise the risk that groups will feel that violence is their only option. And we've seen this in cases like Palestine, for example, and South Africa under apartheid, and other notable examples where, you know, people's grievances had no outlet in the political system, and so they took to violence as a way of pursuing their claims. All right, so the second question was about how we can establish regime change, presumably in places like the Middle East where, you know, there's been external intervention, and create strong states with a strong enough military to deal with insurgencies. I mean, that's a huge question, and I don't, you know, obviously I can't give an answer, a satisfactory answer to that in a couple of minutes. But one of the things that I would argue is that in trying to change regimes and in trying to create new kinds of political structures and new states, I think we have to go back to, this issue that violence is a constitutive form of social activity and practice. And if we decide that creating a strong state involves militarily and violently defeating your enemies and then establishing enough military force to be able to defeat them again and again if they arise, you're actually simply creating a violent form of politics. And it's likely that that violent form of politics will persist. There's very interesting research by Stephan and Chenoweth. I'm sure you've heard about this. Their major study called Why Civil Resistance Works, where they examined violent and non-violent campaigns, including campaigns of regime change over 100 years. One of the interesting things they found was that if you have violent insurgencies that overthrow regimes and establish new states, within 5 years of that, there's something like a 90% chance that there will be further political violence, a lack of democracy, and very low levels of human rights respect. But if you use non-violent resistance to overthrow a regime and create a non-violent kind of state, 5 years after that happens, there's usually a 90% chance that there's strong democratic institutions and there's strong respect for human rights, and there's a lack low levels of political violence. In other words, this speaks to the constitutive way in which we create states. And so I would suggest that non-violent resistance and political dialogue and building strong civil society and strong non-violent forms of politics should be the long-term strategy we adopt to try and bring about stability and strong, resilient states in places like the Middle East. I mean, obviously, one of the first things that's going to involve is demilitarization, including the demilitarization of those other external powers that are there. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer, but it's the best I've got in this time. So the third question was very interesting about scholarship being fundamentally flawed because it cannot, access some of the classified information that security agencies have about terrorists. Yeah, I'm really not convinced by this argument at all, for a number of reasons. First of all, because I think that there is plenty of information in the public domain. Terrorist groups don't just talk to security agents when they get captured, and they don't just talk in secret. They're usually connected to other broader political movements. There's usually a whole group of supporters, and they have massive, in most cases, massive sort of public communication processes. I think, part of the problem is that our discourse about terrorists has said you can never trust what they say, and they're always lying and they're evil. So why would you listen to them? And I think our discourse has always said, despite what they say, those are not the real motives. Their real motives are evil and bloodthirsty and so on. I think there's plenty of evidence that we can use. In fact, I've got a book on my shelf that was well before 9/11, but it's a collection of manifestos and training manuals and public information given out by militant and terrorist groups over 100 years. At the same time, I think, there are plenty of former terrorists or militant groups that are considered terrorists who are willing to talk to academics. And I think that there are some terrific ethnographies where scholars have gone into communities that are considered terrorist supporting communities, lived with people, talked with them, observed them, and really tried to understand what they're doing. So there's some terrific work, for example, on Hamas, including by Jeroen Gunning, who's one of my former colleagues at Aberystwyth, who lived in Gaza for a long time and did his research. There's an amazing study by Joseba Zulaika, an anthropologist from the Basque Country, on ETA. And this kind of in-depth ethnographic research, I think, actually provides far greater insights and gives you a much greater understanding of the origins, the nature and the causes and the aims and the subjectivities of terrorists and terrorist groups and movements than anything that could be, I think, taken from, any kind of classified information. So I'm really just not convinced that there has to be a fundamental flaw in scholarship. I think the flaw lies in what Joseba Zulaika called the taboo on talking to terrorists. And there is a taboo. There's a feeling amongst many terrorism scholars and by the public and by politicians that terrorists are kind of evil, and not only evil, they're infectious. And if you were to talk to them and try to understand them, you might become infected by their, extreme views. You might be convinced by what they're doing and then develop sympathy for them. So in fact, there is a kind of moral imperative to keep them at a distance, to make sure you never speak to them. I think that kind of attitude and that kind of approach is what makes a lot of terrorism scholarship lacking in scientific validity and depth, because it refuses to engage seriously with its subject. I'll leave it there on that one.
Do we have a time for a shorter question, Andreas, over there?
Yeah, thanks a lot. The questions have been building up, Richard, in the chat. We won't be able to raise them all. They are credit to the exciting talk you have given. But perhaps the following question might be a good one to finish off this evening CSSGJ session. It's raised by Stephen Gates. And he questions whether you have got a solution to the problem of terrorism. Counterterrorism has many facets, writes Stephen, and whilst it isn't perfect, what is the alternative? A state not having a counterterrorism function will not make terrorism go away. So perhaps that's a good, well, in a way, challenge to you, Richard, to basically your fundamental position.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I've got a couple of answers which are probably not going to be satisfactory, but I'll put them out there anyway. I mean, the first issue to my mind is if you have a kind of counterterrorism approach that is causing much more harm than good, and that's leading to huge costs in human life and norms, people being abused and so on, then I would argue that doing nothing is better than that, right? You ought to stop doing something that is, demonstrably counterproductive and demonstrably harmful. And I think it's very hard to look at what the war on terror has done and to look at things like the spread of torture, the use of rendition, the militarization of certain regions, and the kind of proliferation of terrorist groups in a self-fulfilling prophetic way that has occurred, and be able to say that counterterrorism is basically fine, but it's just got a few problems. I think, what we have to say is the war on terror has been much, much worse for security, for human beings, for communities, and for millions of people than the terrorism it was trying to solve. And I would stand by that position. And I would think that you should just stop it. Stop torturing people, stop drone killing people, stop invading countries on counterterrorism pretexts, and reevaluate. And, do some proper evaluation to see. And I think beyond that, the second argument I would make is that it's not a question of doing nothing versus doing the kind of violent, force-based, coercive, intrusive, surveilling forms of counterterrorism that we're doing. It's not a choice between that and nothing. There are lots of other options. And there are growing numbers of programs around the world and situations around the world where people are figuring out how to deal with the threat of violent groups, and as well as the threat of state terrorism and state repression in non-violent ways that are proving to be quite effective. And I think, you know, for me, the fundamental issue is we need to treat terrorism not as a form of violent, unfathomable evil, but as a symptom of our kind of politics that we've established in the world, and that it's a political problem. And the violence of terrorism comes from a political source. And if we can devise political solutions, they will be the most effective forms of counterterrorism. But in order to do that, we have to take history seriously, we have to take human beings seriously, and we have to take the subjectivity of the terrorists seriously, as well as look at the effect of our own counterterrorism actions on the way terrorists have evolved. And so that's what I would say is an alternative. And I think that that leaves us with a lot of things we could do apart from what we're currently doing.
Well, I'd like to thank Professor Richard Jackson on behalf of the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice and the Centre for Conflict, Security and Terrorism at Nottingham University. I'd like to thank everyone, Richard, on behalf of everybody else, seeing as we're in a Zoom call right now. I think that was a brilliant way of ending your very interesting talk, Richard. And all the best. Thank you for giving this talk at such an early hour in New Zealand. It's very much appreciated. And we'll be sharing the talk for other people as it's been recorded. So thank you very much, Professor Jackson.
No, thank you. It's been my pleasure, and thank you for giving up your evening to listen to me. And wherever you are, I wish you all the best.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks a lot. See you.
Thank you.